for being here this morning. In a moment, Ron is going to lead us in an opening prayer. Is there anything that we need to mention before we begin class and have the prayer? Yes. Yes, please remember Randy. His mother passed away the prior week, and so remember Randy and his family. He's still in California, correct? Still taking care of some issues out there. Yes, ma'am. Bob's stent will, November 7th, he's going to get this stent put in. So please remember Bob in prayers. Anyone else or anything else?
Dear kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come together and to learn your word and look at the places that we study in the Bible and see that those are real places and real events. We ask that you comfort Brandon as his family grieves over the passing of their mother. We ask these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ.
Amen. We are coming to a close on this topic, and then we'll move into another subject. I had something planned already, but then something else came up, and so I potentially might use some different material related to the life of Christ. I haven't yet decided, but we'll begin that. The first Sunday in November will be the new study group. If you're in the teen class, you will, first Sunday in November, go back to your teen classes. If you're in Brother Lorenzo's class, you'll remain in here for the time being until such time as he starts his Sunday morning class up again. I do want to remind you, he is at this time still doing the Wednesday night class, but I think that's going to be paused. Is that right, Brother Lorenzo, for a period of time as well? So just be prepared for that Brother Lorenzo's class on Wednesday will be in the adult auditorium as well. We're going to talk about Capernaum today. Capernaum is a city that's not mentioned in the Old Testament at all, but is very prominent in the New Testament. It's mentioned in all four Gospels. It is the center of Jesus' ministry, or at least the beginning of his ministry. We learned some things about Capernaum. If you've been here for the past few weeks and you understand that Capernaum and some of the cities, the two cities we're going to discuss next week, Chorazin and Bethsaida, are all within what's known as the Galilean region, particularly along the coast of the Sea of Galilee, or along the lake of the Sea of Galilee. It's called a sea, but it's really a freshwater body, a lake. It's rather large, but as you saw last week, some of the photographs. So I want to spend today talking specifically about Capernaum, and then next week we'll talk about Chorazin and Bethsaida as well. Show you some things from at least Chorazin, and talk about these three cities collectively, because they actually are linked together, the three of those cities. Jesus links them together, and so I'll save the rest of that for next week when we discuss it. It says here on the little mosaic, you can see on the photograph on the right, Capernaum is the town of Jesus. It is referred to as his hometown. In fact, this morning we're going to be in Matthew chapter 9 and verse number 1 for our sermon. And it'll say that he went to his own city in Matthew chapter 9, verse number 1. And it's talking about this city, Capernaum. And it's many things that have occurred in Capernaum that you are very familiar with, that you may not have associated exactly. Now I do want you to understand, from a geological perspective, Capernaum is not close to Jerusalem. So when you see things that have occurred, for instance, you'll see that after the resurrection, Jesus tells the disciples, or the disciples are told to meet him on the mountain in Galilee. That's no easy journey. It takes a while to get there from Jerusalem, where the crucifixion and the resurrection, or the burial and resurrection, occurred. And so it has some important values. There's some that believe that the area around the Sea of Galilee, specifically, as I mentioned last week, Mount Arbel, is the location of the ascension. I'm not sure that's the location of the ascension, especially if you look at Mark's account and you look at Luke's account. But Matthew does specifically say that Galilee is where Jesus went to meet the 11 after the resurrection. And it appears, according to Mark and Luke's account, that they actually met at another location as well, where the ascension occurred. The ascension essentially, according to Luke's account, is near the area of Bethany. And Bethany is just south of the Sea of Galilee, but opposite side of the Sea of Galilee from where Capernaum is located at. Capernaum's kind of in the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. I didn't put a map up, but hopefully you recall, or if you look at a map, you'll see exactly where that is. I think I have one in my notes, but I didn't put kind of across, diagonal from Mount Arbel that we talked about last week. There's some interesting finds in the city of Capernaum. One is this synagogue that's been discovered there. Here you have a drawing in the sign that's located here that shows that this synagogue was actually a two-story synagogue. And so it was a rather large synagogue. Initially, many of the archaeologists believed that this would have been a first-century synagogue. Some even the structure itself that were from the 4th century, so more likely this is a much later synagogue than the time of Jesus. It is made of limestone. If you've seen, well, you have seen photographs of Jerusalem specifically, limestone is the common stone that's used for the buildings there. In fact, if you're to build a structure in Jerusalem today, you have to build it of limestone. You can't build it of some other structure. Limestone's not indigenous to Israel, which means it's got to be brought in from other places in order to be utilized. And so having this large structure from either the 4th or 5th century, or as some believe, the 2nd or 3rd century, used that a lot. And you can see it as you walk around this area. You can see it in the ground. It's basalt. Basalt is just a volcanic rock. It's black in color, and it's used for, in fact, when I show you some of Chorazin, I'll show you the synagogue there that's made out of basalt. The entire thing was made out of basalt. First century synagogue that was located there in that area. As I mentioned in Matthew 9, Capernaum's referred to as the Lord, as Jesus' own city. We learn from Mark and Luke's account that that's Capernaum that's being discussed there specifically. Jesus performed many, many miracles in this area. If you've been here on Sunday morning for the worship service, you know we've talked about the healing of the blind man. We've talked about the healing of the centurion's servant. We talked around Capernaum. This morning in the worship service, we're going to talk about the paralytic man that Jesus healed. And again, also took place not only in the Sea of Galilee, but specifically in this city of Capernaum. It sits right on the water. In fact, it's probably only about a 100-foot or 200-foot walk from the edge of the water and a very important place of Jesus' ministry. Also, Capernaum is where several of the apostles were selected. The two sets of brothers that Jesus called to follow him, that took place in Capernaum. Now, it appears that Peter and Andrew were from Capernaum, but James and John had moved there from a different area, because it says in other passages that they're from a different location. But ultimately, the calling of those disciples occurred at Capernaum. Also, Matthew, the tax collector. I don't know how many of you have watched the show The Chosen, but you might have some insight or have some pictures in your mind about some of those areas as you watch that show. Again, that calling took disciples after Jesus' resurrection. The 11 disciples went to the area of Galilee and to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. That's found in Matthew chapter 28 if you want to read about it. Let's talk a little more about this synagogue. Here's the ancient ruins of the synagogue. If you look at the lower level there's a black structure kind of in which the limestone sits on. It's a foundation that's around that, and very likely the foundation of the first century synagogue. We read about in Scripture that Jesus taught in the synagogue of Capernaum. This is very likely the foundation of that synagogue. It's made of that volcanic rock, and you can see it just laying on the ground there. The other limestone there is probably later 4th, 5th century specifically. Capernaum sat on an international highway running between Egypt and Babylon. So it was a very important trade route. Fishermen were there as a very important fish area. As we know, Peter, James, and John and Andrew were all fishermen by trade. And so there was a large fishing population that was there. But it was also an important place because goods would be traveling between those two nations, Babylon and Egypt, and Capernaum was on the way to that. I showed you last week, if we were standing in Mount Arbel, you could see, looking up the valley, there's a road that leads to Bethlehem, and a very beautiful area as well. If you go into that area, it's a lot different climate than Jerusalem is. Definitely a different climate than the area around the Dead Sea and what's known as the wilderness, which is very dry. This is there's a lot of green plant life that's there. It's a very plant populous area as well. Here's where Jesus established his headquarters for the major part of his public ministry. And as I mentioned, James and John and Andrew and Peter were from this area as well. Showing you some additional pictures of the remains of the 5th century or 4th century synagogue that's there. You can see it's a rather large synagogue. I do want you to note the pillars that are located in the photographs. This would have been the pillars that separated and these beams that go across, because there's some engravings on them and there's some remains that are present there that I want to share with you about this particular area that gives us a little more insight. Difficult to see maybe in this photograph, but you can see there's actually some writing that's on this pillar. If you can see my mouse there. Yep, okay, good. There's some writing that's on this pillar, and around the tops of these pillars and around the tops of the beam, specifically this dark area that you really can't see clearly in the photograph, there's also some depictions and some carvings that are in that as well. Again, this is inside that what might be considered the prayer room. You can see some additional pillars there. You can see some tile work placed that area since. Some of this is what they would do is they would place the limestone down and then they'd put a plaster on it and put some mosaic design or some tiles on top of that, and you can kind of see the remains of that there. You can see some of the broken pillars that are there. Again, this would be the first floor. There's nothing remaining of the second story, but it would have been on top of that area there. This is a picture of kind of a doorway that enters into the what's commonly known as the prayer room, or described as the prayer room. It's interesting. I took this picture because I want to share with you just the door frame and how it would have been placed in that area. You can see the holes that are in the ground there, and there's some notches on either side of the door. These would have been large, heavy doors that would have been placed in that area, and I kind of these large doors on the entrance to this synagogue area. For me, it was a little impressive. Limestone is a very hard stone, and you can see that they've chiseled out that area to be able to place the doors don't remain. The wood would have deteriorated long ago, but what still remains is the areas where that door was being held. These are some of the beams, the cross beams that the second floor would have been sitting on. They're now laying on the ground, or they're actually on some metal platforms there, but they're on display so you can see what they would have looked like a little closer up. For instance, in this particular photograph, you see the Star of David in different forms, and you see a cluster of grapes that are located there, common for the Jews, or some larger ones here as well. Again, a cluster of grapes here. We have some different types of flowers that are mentioned. These appear to be pomegranates. Pomegranates were common in the carvings of the temple itself. If you go back to the first temple period during Solomon, you'll hear about or read about the pomegranate carvings that were in the temple as well. So we see those that are located there. Some interesting things, and I'll talk about this particular one in a moment, but some interesting things about the carvings. There are several carvings that have some strange, what we might consider some strange carvings in it. For instance, in this, on one of these carvings, and I apologize, that adapted the idea of being a Roman colony or a Roman a city that was controlled by the Roman Empire. Also in this, in some of the carvings was what is described as a Medusa. Now again, I don't have a photograph of that particular one. I thought I had taken one because I remember seeing the carving, but I looked and searched diligently and could not find a photograph of it. But that particular carving appears to be the head of a woman with snakes on her head. I mean, it appears to look like a Medusa. So I don't know if Greek mythology had somehow permeated its way into the Jewish tradition during the time that this synagogue, this older synagogue, was built. But that was an interesting thing that was carved into some of that. Now, there's a lot of common carvings, animals, clusters in it, on some type of cart. So it could be that this is a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant as it was brought back. As you recall that it was taken captive by the Canaanites or Philistines, and then it was brought back to Jerusalem, and ultimately it was placed on that cart, and a new ox had stumbled, and the cart began to fail, and Uzzah reached up to touch the cart and was struck dead because he disobeyed God's command about touching the Ark of the Covenant. It's possible, but this is a reflection of that. I think more likely, based on some discoveries of this particular synagogue, it's more likely the Ark of Scrolls. And what the Ark of Scrolls is a mobile ark or platform in which the Torah and the scrolls of the Old Testament would have been kept, and they would roll it between different places, and they would bring those articles maybe to different synagogues. It was in this synagogue that they found, the one that I just showed you the photographs of, there is no place for the Torah or the scrolls to be placed. Many of the synagogues would have a section that was carved out specifically for the scrolls to be kept in, and this particular synagogue does not have any of that. Now, it's possible it was on the second floor and it's been destroyed. Possible that it could have been destroyed in the meantime. So it's not confirmed one way or another what this is, whether it's the Ark of the Covenant on wheels, which it should not be on, or whether it's the Ark of Scrolls. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, we really don't know much about the Ark of the Covenant after or during the Babylonian captivity. It appears that it might have been seized during the Babylonians. The Bible doesn't really address what happened to it, but it's believed again that it was captured during that period of time. So that's many, many years before Christ, thousands of years before Christ, or 1,000 years before Christ. This is about probably 400 to 500 years after, or 300 to 400 years after Christ. So I find it highly unlikely that this is a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant on a cart. Again, it could be a depiction of that account with Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant being pulled. We don't see the oxen. All we see is the picture of the ark there on some type of wheels. Here's some more diagram. This is a pillar that's no longer standing inside that synagogue, but you can notice candlesticks as it's referred to. And so you see that carved into the top of that pillar there. Here's another stone that's found there, and again you see a carving of the menorah in this larger stone that's just that they found in this location as well. So just some interesting carvings that are in this 4th or 5th century or potential 4th or 5th century synagogue, and we see some of the Jewish related things in there. But again, we also saw some strange things like that Medusa head and the Roman eagle as being a part of that. Normally the Jews would not have associated themselves with Rome, so it's very strange that would be found inside of a synagogue in this area. Anybody know what that is? That is a millstone. Now you got a visual picture of what a millstone looks like. It's a rather large stone. It's used to grind grain and wheat and those kinds of items. And so they would have like in the top there, they would have like another piece that would come up, and they'd be able to put like a rod through there, and one or two people would then walk that rod around, and they would grind down that grain or material using that millstone. I have another picture of the millstone inside. I think it's right here. There you go, the grinding stone. So it would be placed again inside of that, and they would grind down that area. Now, this particular millstone is made of basalt. Common for the area around the Sea of Galilee. Not really common in Jerusalem. But again, as you walk around the Sea of Galilee, especially on the north and the northeast side, as I walked around that area, you see this volcanic rock everywhere. So they're going to obviously use by which they could carry out just their daily duties. Anybody know what that is? A juicer? Is that what you said? That's actually pretty close. It is a wine press or olive press, so it is kind of a juicer. And what they do is they'd smash those things, and the juice would run down into that carved out area that's a circle. And normally there's like a little lip, I don't know if you can see it here, that it would flow out into, and they'd have a bucket or something below in which they'd capture that liquid. I have a better photograph of one that's a little bit higher, I think, so you can get a better. Actually, I take that back, because that's not in Capernaum that I have that photo. I have to share that with you next week, because it's in Chorazin. Anybody know what that is? Hint, there's a sign on the bottom that tells you what it is. It's an olive press. Can you see the sign there? Olive press. There you go. It's an olive press. Again, they would place the olives on there, and they would use some large stone to crush them down, and then the liquid would flow out of the area there into some type of bucket or something in which they would capture that. So when you think about these things in Scripture, olive presses, wine presses, when you think about the millstone as well, you can have a visual picture of what those actually would have looked like. Now I want to start by saying we don't know for certain that this is Peter's house. There is no real, I shouldn't say there's no real evidence. There's no sign that says, here lived Peter, right? Some of you, if you've lived at a house where they poured concrete, you'll see the handprint there and some kid's name, right? You probably did that. There's none of that. But there is some evidence to suggest that this might have been Peter's house. One of the things that's suggested there is, you can kind of see in the photograph, kind of an octagon-shaped building that was there. It's from the 2nd century. There was actually a 7th century church that was on top of a 2nd century church that was on top of a house, a small house that was in that area. Now, Robert will share with you, and has, and so have I several times, anytime there was a place that was an important place, or some place they thought were religious, what'd they do, Robert?
According to tradition.
Well, that's true, but what would they build on top of it? They build a church on top of it, right? So here in this particular house that's sitting in Capernaum, a rather small home that's in Capernaum, was 2 churches. One, so possibly some 10 to 90 years later, this church was placed on top of this house, and then another one on top of that later in the 7th century AD, around 600 to 699 AD. This is a picture from the front of the synagogue. You can see towards the back there's the Sea of Galilee, and I'm looking towards this current, well, you have some building structures here, but underneath this is that the remains of that small house that was under the 2nd century and 7th century church. If you've heard me, if you've been in the class each time I've taught, I've said this a couple times. Archaeology is a destructive trade, because they had to destroy the 7th century church, and they had to destroy the 2nd century church in order to get to the house that was underneath it. They do collect those items, and they try to reform them the way they are, but it's very destructive by trade, because what often happened, and still happens, is when something's destroyed, they just build on top of it. And so you've seen some of the layers that I've described in an example of that. This is from the side, looking again towards that church. You can kind of see it's currently a church that there's 2 religious groups. One is Greek Orthodox. I forget what the other one is, that kind of control this area. When you walk up to the front, there was a monk standing there. If you're a male and didn't have your head covered, you couldn't come in. If you were a female and you were wearing shorts, you couldn't come in, right? So they restrict the ability. Really, there's not much to the inside of the church, but they do have a plexiglass floor that allows you to see down to where that first century building is that's thought to be Peter's house. So I'll show you some photographs of that. This is underneath that. You can see the walls of this house, and then inside of it is a smaller room. This would have been the outward part of the house, and so it's rather small. It's not a very big house. When you think about, if this is Peter's house, when you think about Jesus going in and healing his mother-in-law, potentially that took place in this area. The walls around it are first century, and so they would match the time frame as being during the time of Jesus and the Apostle Peter. This is a more closer view of that inward room. It's like circular. I'm told that I didn't see other structures this way, but I'm told that it wasn't unpopular to have private homes that were made in this way, where you had a master bedroom, right? And then the areas around it. I don't know if you want to make a circle master bedroom or not, but there you go. Here's that plexiglass floor inside the church building, looking down into some of the structure there. And again, you can see the older stones. You are not allowed to actually go underneath the building and touch it and see it. So the best you can do is take photographs from the side, go inside the church that's located there, take pictures down through the glass or the plexiglass floor and see some of the remains there.
One thing you didn't say is, usually that monk has got his hand out also.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think of that, but that's right. He did have his hand out.
They all do.
And he was dressed like a monk. I mean, from what I think of when I see monk. I did want to mention that going back to the synagogue for a moment, the synagogue is about 60, or the foundation, that basalt, that volcanic foundation of the synagogue that I showed you a photograph of, it's about 60 feet wide and 75 feet long. So that'll give you an indication of how long that is. So from Peter's proposed house here to the synagogue is about 2 blocks away, probably less than 100 feet. I showed you some. Let me go back to the picture so you can kind of see it again. This is again looking from the synagogue towards that location that's identified as Peter's house, or suspected to be Peter's house. So that gives you an idea of how close his house would have been to the synagogue area. This is some of the buildings, remains of walls and structures that are around that area. This is between the synagogue and the house that's identified as Peter's house. I found this structure to be very interesting. I'm not sure what it is, but you can see that it's kind of portioned off into little areas. Perhaps it was where animals were kept. I don't know. I couldn't figure out what it was, and the guide that was with us didn't share anything on what he knew about that area. But very, very interesting stuff. It's 84, I said 100 feet. It's 84 feet from the synagogue to that house where Peter's located at. That house that was discovered underneath the 2 churches that was there is a fairly recent discovery. I wouldn't say recent because it was 1968, but that's the year, but for some of you that you might consider that recent. It's recent in the idea of, Jesus left this earth 2,000 years ago, and so it wasn't until 1968 that location was even discovered in that area. This is some of the area around the synagogue. I think this is just outside of the synagogue. I wanted to show you again some of the tile work that remains in this area. You can see how delicate it is, and how much effort they went to place these pieces of tile along with these circular designs inside of the area. They were not short of craftsmanship when they built many of these structures. Even if it's the case that this was built in the 5th or 6th century, this synagogue, built in the 5th or 6th century, it was still not a modern period of time. It would have been considered part of the ancient world. And then standing, and you can see some of the water that's there. I showed you the video last week of what's just waves were created by a very small amount of wind that was occurring in that area. Now, next week, I'm going to talk about two other cities that are also in the area, just in the immediate vicinity of Capernaum, and that is Bethsaida and Chorazin. And if you're not familiar, maybe I'll remind you if you don't remember, these are the three cities that Jesus cursed. And we'll talk about next week that cursing, and I'll show you some photographs from Chorazin and the synagogue that's located there. But one interesting thing about all three of these cities is they are no longer populated. Nobody lives there. They're basically abandoned archaeological sites. As far as city goes, they don't exist as a city. Now, I showed you a church building that exists there, and so there are some religious groups that still exist specifically in Capernaum, not so much in Chorazin and Bethsaida, but they're no longer occupied as a populous city. And that's unusual because, as I pointed out earlier, with Capernaum specifically, it would be along the trade route from Egypt to Babylon. So it would be a great place to have, and was in the first century, a rather large city along the coast of, or the lake line or the shoreline there of the Sea of Galilee. It was an important fishing village. It produced a lot of the fish for that area and for the areas around it. When you think about Jerusalem, Jerusalem's not near any bodies of water, and so for them to have fish, guess where they'd have to come from? They'd have to come from along the Mediterranean or from the Sea of Galilee. And so ultimately that's where the fish would come from. And so it's unusual that this would not have remained a very populous city. Perhaps the cursing that Jesus gave of these cities kept them from becoming populous even up until this day. All right, I think that's the last photograph I have. Yes, it is. So any questions about Capernaum? Greg? I would guess from the account, as you read the account in the Gospels, that she was in Peter's house. I don't know where they would get the idea that she lived next door, unless maybe, we took a modern day idea of moving your mother-in-law in, and you don't want her in the same house, so you move her next door. I don't know where that idea would come from, but maybe you do. No, I don't know. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't hear about that.
The other thing they said at the time we were there, some of the people had lunch and had certain fish that was just kind of common to that lake. And we were out.
Because you're moving and walking, right? You need the energy.
And I would just bring snacks so that, and they happened to just eat that particular fish, some of them. I didn't try it.
Yeah. I don't know if, post-COVID, some of that went away, or I can tell you while we were there, there were not very many people there. There was our group and maybe another small group that was there, but there weren't whole lot of people there. And I didn't see anybody selling things. There was no memorabilia being sold. There was a small shop as you walk in to the facility, because there's gates that lead into that area. They've got it all blocked off now, but because you got to pay to get in. So as you get into that area, there was a small gift shop, but there really wasn't much to that even. Any other comments or questions about Capernaum? Keep it in mind, we're going to talk about it during my sermon today, because the event that we're going to discuss in Matthew chapter 9, verses 1 through 8 took place right here in this city. Greg?
One last question I have. So I picked up, I don't know if you're going to bring it out, but how many miracles he performed around the Sea of Galilee. It's really amazing when you see that on print. I picked up a nice, beautiful map that on there.
Yeah.
We were able to get that.
No, I didn't see that. That would have been nice. Do you still have it?
Bring it next week.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
We can pass it around or whatever.
Yeah. Or take a picture of it. Maybe I can put it up on the PowerPoint slide. That'd be good. So for those on Zoom, or not Zoom, Facebook and YouTube Live, If you didn't hear what Greg said, he talked about a map that he had that demonstrated or showed all the miracles that Jesus performed in this area around Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. And it's going to be a lot, because most of the stuff that's recorded in Scripture took place here. Most of the miracles took place in this region, in this area. Which is why when Jesus curses them, he curses them specifically because of the fact that they've had all of these things occur, and yet they still did not believe in who he was. So we'll talk more about that next week. But if you have that and can share that, Greg, that'd be great. Any other questions or comments about Capernaum, Sea of Galilee? I must be a great teacher. Come on, any questions? Go ahead. So it's located kind of in the north part of Israel. It would be in what's known as the Galilean region, but it's quite a distance from the city of Jerusalem. So it's in the north part of Israel, north of where Jerusalem is. But if you are traveling to, even though on a map it would be north of Jerusalem, if you are traveling there and you read about it in the New Testament, it's going to say they went down to the Sea of Galilee. And the reason why it says that is because the Sea of Galilee is still below. We shared with you the Dead Sea is about 1,500 feet below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is still below sea level. And Jerusalem is about 1,500 feet or 1,900 feet above sea level. So you would have to go down in elevation to get there, even though on a map you're going up. So don't confuse that. We read maps by up and down based on whether they're north and south. They would talk about those kinds of things based on elevation change. So if you're in Jerusalem and you go to Syria, you're going down, or to the Sea of Galilee, you're going down, to the Dead Sea or Jericho, you're going down, because it's higher in elevation. By the way, that speaks to the fact that the way that's used in Scripture, the description of up and down, speaks to the credibility of the Bible coming from God, right? They don't have, and did not have during that time, the same scientific ability we have to measure what the height of a certain area was. And so, yes, they could have guessed because you're at a higher elevation, but I have to tell you, based on the way the terrain is, there's places where I would not know if I was higher or lower than the city of Jerusalem. For instance, Mount Arbel, which I showed you, was much higher than the Sea of Galilee. If you were to ask me today without looking on a map, I have no idea if that's higher than Jerusalem. I would speculate it's probably not, but I don't know. I don't know. Yes, sir, Carrie.
With the volcanic rock here,
The basalt rock?
was there a lot of volcanoes in that area?
Yes, there were. And in fact, when you read about in Matthew 24, and some of our premillennials list friends, they take parts of Matthew 24 and they try to apply it to the Judgment Day scene. But the beginning of Matthew 24, the questions asked of Jesus, Jesus says to his apostles that he's in the temple complex area. He says, no stone will be left unturned. And they ask Jesus the question, when will these things occur? And he describes when will they occur. And one of the signs of the occurrence of the destruction of the temple, which we know from history occurred in AD 70, one of the signs was earthquakes. And there were earthquakes recorded in history between just prior to AD 70 that destroyed regions. I showed you a couple of weeks ago, we were in, not Shiloh, one of the other cities I showed you, the Decapolis city. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but it was one of the Decapolis, the 10 cities that were Roman. I showed you some of the pillars that were laying on the ground, you recall. That all of that destruction in that particular city was caused by an earthquake, by a volcanic eruption, ultimately, that caused an earthquake. So there is some descriptions of that kind of thing. And there's still some active volcanoes in that area. I'm not sure... I'm trying to remember, there was some mention of an active volcano that was on the Jordan side of the Sea of Galilee, which would be on the east side. But I don't remember if it was in this area or whether it was further south. Good question. Anything else? I got 30 seconds. I can answer quickly. All right, so next week will be our last week in the Footsteps Through Israel. I hope you found this to be a helpful study to look at some of these things and see them and then read about certain accounts in the Bible and be able to relate it. I certainly, I haven't seen photos like this before, so I can't relate to how you do. But being there, I have to tell you, for me, personally, it's put color on a black and white photo. I guess that's the best way I could describe it, you know. Yes, ma'am. Would a compass be different? What do you mean? No, it would be the same. Yeah. All right, with that, let's go ahead and close with a prayer, and we'll be dismissed and prepare for our worship service this morning. Would you bow with me? Father God, we're grateful for your Son Jesus, for the life that he lived and the death that he suffered on our behalf. And we're thankful for the accounts that we read about, specifically in the Gospels, where we can see the many miracles that he did and the areas in which he operated. We pray, Father, that as we look at these things and we learn of these things, that they will enhance our faith. They will help us in being able to reach others, help us to be able to teach, help us to be able to describe to others the environment in which these things took place. And we're grateful, Father, for the archaeological evidence that has been discovered that helped to confirm the things that are read about in your word, that we gain from you, but also the archaeological evidence to support that. Thank you, Father, for your blessings for each and every person that's here this morning. Help us now as we prepare for our worship to focus